At 7,200 feet above the ground, commercial aircraft are supposed to be safe. The climb is complete. The danger of takeoff is behind you. The aircraft is accelerating, stabilizing, settling into the sky. But on this flight, 7,200 feet became the beginning of the end. Lufthansa Cargo Flight 8533 was not a passenger flight filled with families or tourists. It was a cargo operation, quiet, professional, routine. No cabin announcements, no applause on landing. Just experienced pilots, a proven aircraft, and a schedule to keep. The aircraft was a Boeing 727, a three-engine jet designed in an era when airplanes were built strong, fast, and unapologetically manual. It had served airlines around the world for decades. By the time of this flight, the 727 had already earned its reputation as rugged, capable, and demanding. It was not an aircraft that forgave carelessness, but it rewarded discipline. On the day of the accident, nothing about the departure suggested danger. Weather conditions were within limits. The aircraft was certified. The crew was qualified. The cargo was loaded. Systems checks were completed. There were no warnings, no delays, no sense that this flight would ever be remembered. This was supposed to be routine. Those are the most dangerous words in aviation. As the Boeing 727 accelerated down the runway, everything behaved normally. Thrust was set, instruments were scanned, airspeed increased smoothly, rotation occurred at the correct speed. The aircraft lifted off cleanly, climbing away from the airport exactly as designed. Positive rate, gear up, climb power set. The cockpit atmosphere was calm, professional, focused. This phase of flight is familiar to every pilot, busy but predictable. The aircraft was heavy, as cargo jets often are, but well within performance limits. Nothing was wrong, at least nothing appeared to be wrong. As the Boeing 727 climbed through several thousand feet, the crew monitored engine performance closely. 3 engines meant redundancy, but also complexity. The aircraft required constant attention to balance, thrust symmetry, and performance trends. And then, somewhere during the climb, something changed. Not abruptly, not violently, but subtly. The kind of change that doesn't trigger alarms immediately, but demands intuition to recognize. Engine indications began to diverge. Not enough to scream failure, just enough to whisper imbalance. Thrust did not feel perfectly even. Control inputs required slight correction, nothing dramatic but persistent. Experienced pilots noticed these things instinctively. At around 7,200 feet, the aircraft was still climbing. Airspeed was adequate. The flight profile looked normal. But beneath the surface, the margin was shrinking. This was not a sudden catastrophe. It was a slow erosion of safety. And erosion is far more dangerous than explosion. The Boeing 727, unlike modern aircraft, did not manage itself. It did not automatically redistribute thrust. It did not simplify the problem. It expected pilots to diagnose, decide, and act, quickly, accurately, and under pressure. That expectation had always been part of its design philosophy. But design philosophy cannot change physics. As climb continued, performance no longer matched expectation. The aircraft struggled. Not dramatically, but noticeably. Vertical speed decreased. Control inputs increased. The cockpit workload rose. Something was wrong, but not yet obvious. At this altitude, pilots still have options, but fewer than they realize. Returning to the airport is no longer a simple reversal. Energy, weight, and configuration now matter more than instinct. The Boeing 727 was still flying, but it was no longer comfortable. This was the moment when recognition mattered more than reaction. The difference between diagnosing correctly or misjudging what was happening would decide the fate of Flight 8533. Aviation accidents rarely begin with chaos. They begin with confusion. And at 7,200 feet, confusion was quietly taking control. In the next part, we go inside the cockpit, into the engine behavior, the decisions being made, and the performance problem that no checklist could fully explain. At cruising altitude, engine failures announce themselves clearly. Alarms sound, gauges spike. The aircraft reacts instantly. But during climb, especially in older analog aircraft like the Boeing 727, failures do not always arrive with drama. Sometimes they creep in quietly, disguised as performance anomalies that are easy to underestimate. This was one of those moments. As Flight 8533 continued climbing, the crew's attention shifted toward engine performance trends. The Boeing 727 was powered by 3 engines, 2 mounted on the sides of the rear fuselage, and 1 buried deep in the tail through an S-duct. This configuration provided redundancy, but it also complicated diagnosis. When something went wrong, identifying which engine was responsible was not always immediate. The aircraft did not yaw sharply. No fire warnings activated. No master caution demanded action. Instead, the aircraft simply felt wrong. Engine indications began to diverge subtly. Exhaust gas temperatures were no longer perfectly aligned. Thrust output was uneven, not enough to register as a textbook failure, but enough to erode climb performance. The aircraft was still gaining altitude, but more slowly than expected. This is where experience becomes critical. The Boeing 727 required pilots to actively manage thrust balance. Automatic protections were minimal by modern standards. If one engine underperformed, even slightly, the aircraft would compensate aerodynamically long before alarms triggered. That compensation masked the real problem. The aircraft is flying on borrowed performance. At this stage, pilots faced a dilemma common in aviation accidents. Was this a transient anomaly, or the early stage of a serious failure? Acting too early risked unnecessary emergency procedures. Acting too late risked losing control of the situation entirely. Hesitation becomes dangerous when margins are thin. Investigators later determined that one engine was no longer producing expected thrust. Not a complete failure, not a dramatic shutdown, but a degradation significant enough to matter at high weight and low speed. Partial failures are the hardest to recognize. The Boeing 727 did not declare an emergency for you. It expected pilots to feel it, see it, and interpret it correctly. The crew adjusted power settings, attempting to regain symmetry. For a brief moment, it seemed to work, but the aircraft was still losing its edge. As the climb continued, vertical speed dropped further. Airspeed decayed slightly. Control forces increased. The aircraft demanded more attention, more thrust, more precision, more workload. Every correction bought time, but time was becoming expensive. This was no longer a question of comfort. It was a question of capability. At 7,200 feet, the aircraft was high enough to feel safe, but low enough that recovery options were narrowing rapidly. A full engine failure at this point would have been manageable. A partial failure, quietly draining performance, was far more dangerous. Because partial failures lie. They convince crews that the aircraft is still capable, right up until it isn't. Investigators later noted that engine instrumentation did not clearly communicate the severity of the thrust loss. In older aircraft, performance interpretation relies heavily on pilot judgment rather than automated alerts. Judgment was now the most critical system on board. The crew began considering contingency actions, leveling off, returning to the airport, reducing climb rate to stabilize speed. None of these options were yet mandatory, but all were now on the table. The window for a clean solution was closing. As Flight 8533 pushed onward, the aircraft crossed a threshold where performance margins became razor thin. The Boeing 727 was still airborne, still controllable, still responding. But the climb that should have been safe was quietly turning into a trap. In the next part, the situation deteriorates rapidly when degraded performance meets aerodynamic reality, and the crew is forced to confront a problem that no longer has an easy answer. By the time Lufthansa Cargo Flight 8533 reached the mid-climb phase, the Boeing 727 was no longer operating with healthy margins. What had begun as a subtle imbalance had now matured into a measurable performance problem. The aircraft was still airborne, still controllable, but the numbers were no longer where they should have been, and in aviation, numbers never lie for long. Climb rate continued to decay, not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily enough to force attention. Airspeed hovered near the lower end of the acceptable range. Pitch attitude increased slightly to maintain altitude, a natural response that quietly traded energy for lift. This trade is always temporary. The Boeing 727, heavy with cargo and fuel, needed thrust to keep climbing. With one engine underperforming, the remaining engines were being asked to compensate. They did, but only to a point. Every additional degree of pitch demanded more power. Every additional knot of drag drained performance further. This is how airplanes get trapped. Inside the cockpit, workload intensified. Engine instruments were cross-checked repeatedly. Power levers were adjusted in search of balance. Control pressures were heavier now, requiring constant correction to maintain heading and speed. The aircraft was telling a story. It just wasn't speaking loudly enough. As speed decayed further, the Boeing 727 entered a narrow aerodynamic corridor. Too slow to climb efficiently, too fast to descend safely without planning. This region leaves very little room for indecision. It is where accidents begin to accelerate. The crew faced a critical realization. The aircraft was no longer climbing because it wanted to. It was climbing because the pilots were forcing it to. And forcing an aircraft to climb against physics is never sustainable. Investigators later noted that at this point, the correct response required a decisive shift in strategy, either leveling off to regain airspeed or initiating an early return. But recognizing that moment in real time is extraordinarily difficult, especially when the aircraft still appears flyable. This is the illusion of control. As the climb continued, the margin narrowed further. Stick forces increased. Control inputs became more deliberate. The aircraft responded, but sluggishly. This sluggishness was not a system failure. It was aerodynamic reality asserting itself. The Boeing 727 was approaching its limit. Angle of attack increased subtly. Not enough to trigger an immediate warning, but enough to place the aircraft closer to stall than intended. In older aircraft, these cues are not always dramatic. They must be felt, interpreted, respected. The danger was now real. Engine power adjustments could no longer fully compensate. The underperforming engine continued to contribute less thrust than required. The remaining engines were near their limits. The aircraft's climb profile flattened. Altitude gains slowed to a crawl. This was the moment when recovery options began disappearing. Turning back now would require careful energy management. Continuing straight ahead offered no improvement. Leveling off risked further speed loss. Every option carried consequence. In aviation, the worst place to be is between decisions. The Boeing 727 was now flying on precision alone. Any distraction, any misjudgment, any delay would tip the balance. And then the aircraft crossed that invisible line. the one pilots never want to approach. The line where lift begins to surrender faster than thrust can recover it. In the next part, we examine the final moments, when aerodynamic limits were breached, control authority faded, and the climb that should have been routine became unrecoverable. The transition from a difficult situation to an unrecoverable one is often invisible in aviation. There is no single switch that flips, no instant where the aircraft suddenly announces it is lost. Instead, control fades quietly, masked by familiarity, momentum, and the hope that one more correction will be enough. For Lufthansa Cargo Flight 8533, that moment arrived without drama and without mercy. As the Boeing 727 struggled to maintain airspeed, pitch attitude increased incrementally. Each small adjustment was logical. Each made sense in isolation. But together, they pushed the aircraft deeper into a region where lift was becoming unreliable and control margins were vanishing. This is how aircraft are unintentionally flown into danger. The underperforming engine continued to rob the aircraft of climb capability. The remaining engines were already near their operational limits. Thrust was no longer the solution. Energy management was. But energy had already been spent. The airspeed decayed further, not rapidly, not dramatically, but enough. The Boeing 727 began to exhibit subtle aerodynamic warnings, buffeting, increased control forces, delayed response to inputs. In older aircraft, these are not filtered through computers. They are felt directly through the controls. The aircraft was speaking clearly now. Angle of attack increased past the point where lift generation remained stable. The wing was still producing lift, but unevenly, unpredictably. Control harmony degraded. Small corrections produced delayed or exaggerated responses. This is the edge of the envelope. Beyond it, there are no procedures, only physics. Investigators later determined that the aircraft entered an aerodynamic stall condition during the climb. Not the dramatic, nose-dropping stall taught in training, but a high-altitude, low-energy stall where recovery requires altitude, thrust, and time. None of those were available. As lift collapsed asymmetrically, the Boeing 727 began to roll. The crew attempted corrective inputs, rudder, aileron, thrust adjustments, but the control surfaces no longer had clean airflow to work with. Control authority was slipping away. The aircraft's nose dropped, but not cleanly. The roll intensified. One wing stalled deeper than the other. The aircraft entered an uncontrolled descent. At this point, recovery was no longer a matter of skill. It was a matter of altitude. And altitude had already been spent during the climb. Ground proximity increased rapidly. There was no time to reconfigure, no time to regain energy. The Boeing 727 was no longer flying. It was falling. The final moments happened too quickly for correction, and too slowly to stop. The aircraft impacted terrain shortly afterward. There were no survivors. In aviation, accidents are often described in seconds, but this one was built over minutes, by subtle indications, delayed recognition, and a performance problem that never announced itself clearly enough. The crash of Lufthansa Cargo Flight 8533 was not caused by a single mistake. It was caused by a narrowing margin, and the moment when that margin disappeared completely. In the aftermath of the crash, the silence was heavier than the wreckage itself. Lufthansa Cargo Flight 8533 had vanished from the sky, not because of a single catastrophic failure, but because a series of small, survivable problems aligned at the worst possible moment. Investigators arrived with one central question: how could an experienced crew, flying a proven aircraft, lose control during a phase of flight that should have been routine? The answer did not point to negligence. It pointed to margins. The investigation revealed that one engine's partial thrust loss was the initiating event, but not the sole cause. The failure did not announce itself with alarms or dramatic indications. It degraded performance quietly, steadily, and deceptively. In a heavy aircraft, during climb, that degradation mattered far more than it appeared. Partial failures are the most dangerous failures. They erode safety without demanding action. Investigators concluded that the Boeing 727's performance envelope had been unintentionally exceeded. As the crew attempted to maintain climb, energy was traded for altitude. Airspeed slipped. Angle of attack increased. The aircraft entered a region where lift could no longer be sustained, despite engines producing power and pilots applying correct control inputs. Physics does not negotiate. The aircraft's design philosophy also came under scrutiny. The 727 was built in an era that placed responsibilities squarely on pilots. Automation was minimal. Protections were limited. Warnings were subtle. This philosophy demanded constant vigilance and decisive action, but it also left little room for ambiguity when performance margins narrowed. Ambiguity was the enemy in this accident. Training, procedures, and human factors were examined closely. The crew had followed standard practices, but standard practices, investigators noted, do not always account for partial failures during high-weight climbs. The event highlighted a gap between textbook scenarios and real-world complexity. The aircraft was not misflown. It was misunderstood, briefly but critically. As a result of the investigation, recommendations focused on recognition and prevention. Greater emphasis on early performance trend monitoring. Clearer guidance on leveling off to protect airspeed. Stronger training for partial power loss scenarios. And a renewed understanding that climb performance is never guaranteed, only managed. These changes would save lives later. Because accidents, when studied honestly, become teachers. The legacy of Lufthansa Cargo Flight 8533 is not found in headlines or statistics. It is found in simulator syllabi, in revised procedures, and in pilots who choose to level off earlier, turn back sooner, and respect the quiet warning signs that numbers sometimes whisper before they scream. At 7,200 feet, the margin disappeared, but the lesson endured. Aviation safety advances not because airplanes fail, but because the industry listens when they do.